Bore da pawb, croeso cynnig I chi gyd. Good morning, welcome to this Cardiff University webinar. This is the first of a new series of webinars under the title Informing Policy. And what we're trying to achieve with these webinars is allowing Cardiff University academics to speak directly with policymakers on a variety of topics where our research expertise can inform policy development. So today, as you all know, we're addressing the huge policy challenges presented by the current cost of living crisis. We'll hear first from Cian Siôn of the Welsh Governance Centre, and we'll then have some insights from Dr. Steffan Evans, who is Head of Policy at the Bevan Foundation, before we come to questions from you. To turn then briefly to introduce Cian, without trying to embarrass him, he joined the Wales Governance Centre in November 2018, conducting research into public finances and as part of the Centre's newly established Wales Fiscal Analysis Programme. And since then, he has led the team's work on local government finance and social care, and he contributes to the Centre's regular publications on devolved public expenditure in Wales. Over to you, please, Cian, diolch.
Diolch yn fawr, Laura. So I'm just going to share my screen. So it's great to be kicking off this webinar series this morning. The Wales Fiscal Analysis team published a report last month outlining the main cost of living pressures on household finances. And as part of that work, we used a tax benefits model to simulate the impact of the various policies that have been announced so far on households at both ends of the income distribution in Wales. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that analysis with you this morning. Just to provide an overview of what I intend to cover in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll begin by outlining the pressures faced by households and highlight why Wales might be particularly vulnerable to current trends in energy prices. Then I'll present our findings on how effective the policy response has been here in Wales, who has been targeted by the policies announced to date, and what further interventions could be made to mitigate the impact for those who stand to be worst affected. And then lastly, I'll be placing the looming drop in household incomes in its longer term context. Now, unfortunately, the outlook for the next 5 years is similarly bleak. I hope to show just how much of a historical anomaly the post-financial crisis period really has been for household incomes. And that, of course, will be exaggerated further by the current cost of living pressures. So plenty to go through. But let's start by looking at energy costs. And as you'll be aware, these are and will continue to be a key driver of the squeeze in household incomes. The standard price cap, of course, increased by 54% earlier this month. But perhaps more worryingly, it is now looking increasingly likely that there will be another big increase in the second half of the year. Cornwall Insights is projecting that the standard price cap could hit £2,600 in October, potentially higher. Even if you take that £2,600 figure, that's more than doubling on the levels that we saw back in March or just last month. So effectively a doubling in just the span of a year. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that when the UK government first announced their flagship energy bills discount policy in February, there was still a possibility that prices would peak and even start to fall before the year ends. And so the idea of smoothing out the higher costs paid by consumers over 5 years wasn't bad per se, but of course since then the picture has changed, not least since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if prices remain at or just under their all-time high next year, I think there will be considerable pressure on the Chancellor to revisit that policy. Politically, I think it would be very difficult for the government to levy an additional £40 on bills to recoup the cost of this year's discount, even if, as a proportion of bills, that is a relatively small amount. Just to illustrate how much of our income goes on energy, we use data from the Living Costs and Food Survey to break down household spending on gas and electricity by income quintile in Wales. And I should point out that these figures are prior to the recent spike in energy prices, but you can see that even back then, the poorest 20% of households in Wales were spending on average around 12% of their after housing cost income on energy bills. And I think this chart really does underline why price increases for energy in particular are likely to disproportionately hit those on lower incomes. Consumption of energy is relatively uniform across the income distribution. It might be slightly higher at the top end because higher income households tend to have larger properties that need heating, but there isn't a massive difference. And what that means is that when you express these energy bills as a proportion of household income, they're a much larger burden or a much larger component of spending for lower income households. On top of that, because demand for energy is relatively what we call inelastic, in other words, households can only reduce their consumption up to a certain amount because obviously electricity and gas are necessary for things like heating, cooking, and so on. It won't be possible for many households to respond to these price increases by reducing their consumption. There are other reasons why Wales might be particularly vulnerable if the cost of heating remains high. It might not come as a surprise to hear that Wales has an older and a less energy efficient housing stock than the England and Wales average. In Gwynedd, for instance, 56% of properties were built before 1945, the highest percentage in Wales. And it's perhaps not entirely coincidental that Gwynedd also has the highest rates of fuel poverty, according to the Welsh Government's modelled estimates. Now, of course, it's not just energy prices that are rising. The latest consumer price inflation data shows that prices increased by 7% in the 12 months to March. That's up from 6.2% in the previous month. The chart on the screen shows the forecasts that were produced by the OBR last month in purple, and the forecast they produced in October last year in blue. And you can see in the latest forecast in purple, the quarterly CPI inflation rate is now projected to peak at close to 9% later this year, which would be the highest level since the 1980s. And since October, there has been a shift in the OBR's thinking on this. So at the beginning of the year, the consensus was that these inflationary pressures would largely be transitory and peak in the spring of this year. But the prospect that energy prices will remain elevated now is a very real one. And the longer that they remain sustained at this high level, that increases the likelihood that producers, manufacturers increase prices for other goods and services to reflect their higher manufacturing and distribution costs. So the OBR now doesn't expect the inflation rate to peak until the fourth quarter of 2022, which will prolong, of course, the squeeze on household budgets. But it is important to recognise that households' experience of inflation will differ as well. So back in December, the ONS published experimental data showing the CPI rate for households in the second poorest income decile and households in the second highest income decile. Now, on first glance, the headline rate of inflation appears to be relatively similar. Back then, it was just over 5%, but actually there are differences in what's driving that headline rate for those different households. You can see that the pink bar, the fourth from the top, is considerably larger for poorer households. Essentially, it means that housing and utility costs account for a larger proportion of their spending and hence make a larger contribution to that overall CPI index. Even before the recent price increases, we know that households in the poorest income decile were spending around twice as much on housing and utility costs as those in the top income decile. On the other hand, you've got things like transport spending, including vehicle purchases, spending on restaurants and hotels, furniture, household equipment, recreation and culture. A lot of what we might think of as discretionary or luxury items, they were weightier determinants of the CPI rate for higher income households. And that's important to highlight because it might be easier to cut back on some of these discretionary purchases in response to rising prices than essential goods and services. And also, even if two households face the same increase in prices, their ability to draw down on savings to maintain their consumption level is also going to vary. So, for the poorest households in Wales, reducing their savings rates or drawing down on accumulated wealth is not going to be an option, and it's not going to be a way to respond to these price increases. So, bearing in mind that households might experience these price increases differently, what measures have governments put in place to mitigate the impact so far? Well, how to strike the right balance between policies that, on the one hand, provide broad-based support and guarantee high take-up against more targeted measures, that is a key policy question. And governments across the UK have adopted slightly different approaches here. So the UK government initially relied quite heavily on near universal measures, such as the energy bills discount scheme and the council tax rebate. The discretionary fund that they set up and the proposed changes to the warm homes discount scheme, those things are means tested, but they're a very small share of the total support package that's been announced so far. Now, there might be some rationale for not relying solely on the benefit system to deliver this support. After all, some middle income households will also experience considerable hardship over the coming months. But I do think there was a missed opportunity there, perhaps, to provide more targeted supports. By using the CPI rate from September last year, you'll be aware that working age benefits, pension credit and the state pension only increased by 3.1% this month, more than a 4% reduction in real terms, essentially on account of a technicality with the way those benefits are operated. We also know that the decision to reverse the universal credit uplift back in October impacted approximately a fifth of Welsh households. I mean, at the time, we estimated that the poorest 10% of Welsh households would see a reduction of 5% in their after housing cost income overnight as a result. A slightly different approach by the Welsh Government, which has allocated most of the £340 million package, which was announced in February, on more targeted measures, the biggest being the winter fuel support scheme, which is a £200 payment to universal credit recipients, which will be paid to them later this year. Just to give you an example of a more universal policy measure that was adopted in England, Scotland and Wales, this chart illustrates eligibility for the tax rebate. In other words, the proportion of properties in bands A to D by local authority. Across Wales, roughly 3/4 of households will have or will be receiving this payment on that basis. There is quite considerable variation at a local authority level, as you might expect, given differences in the composition of the housing stock. It is a fairly blunt policy instrument, though I guess one advantage of this approach is that the vast majority of households will receive this payment automatically, so that there isn't going to be a separate application process. And I guess by contrast, one of the challenges perhaps with the Welsh Government's other measures, such as the winter fuel support scheme, will be promoting awareness and ensuring take-up rates for that scheme are as high as possible, given that there is a separate application process for prospective claimants. Many people correctly predicted that the Chancellor would announce a fuel duty cut during the spring statement, and I certainly don't want to dismiss the burden of fuel costs on household budgets, but I do think it's important to point out that this is a measure that will mostly benefit those on higher incomes, who are not only more likely to own cars, but actually considerably more likely to own multiple and bigger cars. So the chart on the left shows how spending on petrol and motor fuel varies across income deciles in the UK. You can see that in 2019, households in the poorest income decile were spending around a third of what households in the richest UK income decile were spending each week on motor fuel. The majority, and this might come as a surprise, but the majority of households in the poorest UK income decile actually don't own any car. Although I should point out that these are UK figures, so ownership rates may be slightly higher in Wales compared to the UK as a whole. Now, these charts show the effects of tax policy changes, energy price increases, and the support measures that have been announced so far on households in Wales by income decile. And there's a lot going on here, I know, so I'll try and walk you through this. If we first focus on the chart on the left, you can see the absolute change in weekly income, and the chart on the right then shows the relative change, so as a proportion of household incomes. The downward facing bars represent the energy price increases that came in April, and the health and social care levy and the frozen income tax thresholds. The upward facing bars then represent the energy bills discount scheme, in green the council tax rebate, the winter fuel support scheme, and then in red the decision to increase the threshold at which people start paying national insurance, which the Chancellor of course announced last month. The black dots then represent the net effect on households. So in other words, what is the impact after all these support measures and the tax changes have been applied? The first thing I wanted to highlight on the chart on the left is that the bottom blue bars are actually fairly constant across the income distribution. The reason Welsh households in the richest income decile face a larger absolute hit is almost entirely because of the tax rises, and in particular, the health and social care levy that came into effect earlier this month. You can also see that the winter fuel support scheme, the orange bars second from the top, are mostly set to benefit those in the poorest income deciles. That's a mark of a fairly well targeted and progressive policy. But the national insurance threshold increase, which is represented by the red bars at the top, that decision is mostly set to benefit those in the top half of the income distribution in Wales. In fact, for every £4 in tax cuts for Welsh households as a result of that policy, we estimate that only £1 will go to the bottom half of the income distribution. And if we zoom into the chart on the right, we can see that even after these energy price increases, the tax changes, the support measures, after all of those have been applied, the average Welsh household is still set to be around £315 a year worse off from April. And households in the poorest income decile will see the largest reduction as a share of their disposable income. Now, crucially, what this chart doesn't show you is the impact of inflation on purchasing power. So in other words, not only will incomes be hit, but that income isn't going to go as far as it used to either because of rising prices. And as we've already established, there's good reason to believe that lower income households will be most affected by these price increases as well because of differences in how their income is spent. The chart also doesn't show the potential for any further increase to the price cap in October, which I think is important to point out. But even so, I think it's quite clear that even after the measures announced so far, the poorest households are set to be disproportionately hit by the rise in energy prices, even though the impact, of course, will be felt across the income distribution. Lastly, I just wanted to reflect on the longer term picture for earnings and incomes in Wales, because right now the focus is understandably on the imminent hit to living standards. But actually, we've had previous episodes of high inflation before. What's different this time round is that it comes on the back of a decade marred by weak earnings growth. So workers in many professions, particularly in the public sector, saw real cuts to their wages for much of the last decade. If we look at the trends in average earnings at a Welsh level, which is what's shown in this chart, we can see that next year earnings will be 5% below their 2009 peak, having adjusted for CPIH inflation. And if we extend that projection forward, using the OBR's forecasts from last month, even by the end of the forecast horizon in 2026, average inflation-adjusted earnings in Wales will remain around 2% below their 2009 peak. And we can even take that a step further and consider the trends in household disposable income, which includes income from all sources, so not just from employment, and also shows the trends after tax and benefits have been applied. And you can see in this chart how the line diverges from its historical trajectory after the 2008 financial crisis. In fact, by 2026, projected disposable incomes of Welsh households will be around £9,000 lower than what would have been the case had that pre-crisis trend been sustained. Effectively, that's 2 decades of zero growth in living standards as measured by household income, which I think is something that's maybe overshadowed perhaps by the focus on the short-term hits to incomes. Now, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they expect the savings ratio to fall back to historic lows this year as households use their accumulated savings to maintain consumption levels. But actually, if you look at the ONS's experimental data on the savings ratio in Wales, that ratio had already plummeted into negative territory before the pandemic began, which suggests that households were on balance already drawing down on savings and accumulating more debts. Now, I think the longer term outlook for household earnings and incomes that's obviously tied into wider questions about why the UK has fared relatively poorly when it comes to economic growth post-financial crisis. But I also don't want to give the impression that governments are powerless to respond to the cost of living crisis either, because in the short term, there are policy interventions that can be made that can, at the very least, influence the distribution of the hits in living standards. And although households across the distribution will be affected, of course, the measures announced so far have failed to mitigate the impact on the poorest households who stand to be most affected. And I think addressing that ought to be really a priority for policymakers over the coming weeks and months. But I'll finish there and hand over to Laura. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr, Cian. Thank you very much for your insight and for so clearly illustrating the challenges that we face and the predicted impact of the policy decisions made thus far. We'll now turn to Dr. Steffan Evans. Steffan is Head of Policy at the Bevan Foundation, having previously been part of the Wales Governance Centre, where he obtained his PhD. His research there examined the impact of devolution on social housing regulation in Wales and England, exploring how and why the law had diverged between both nations. In his current role, Steffan has helped to steer the Bevan Foundation's response to the cost of living crisis, which included the release in February of a Wales action plan to help mitigate its impact. Over to you, Steffan.
Second. There we go. And thanks to Cian as well for sharing his slides with me last night as well, yesterday afternoon, to give me a chance to put a few slides together to respond as well. So yeah, just quickly, in case anyone's unfamiliar with us as the Bevan Foundation, we're a Welsh think tank that works to develop long-term lasting solutions to issues around poverty and inequality. And if you want to find out more about us and how you can support our work, just head over to our website. But to respond to kind of Cian's presentation this morning, and first I want to say that kind of what Cian says absolutely rings true. With all our own research, you know, that this crisis isn't affecting everyone equally. It is affecting those households on the lowest incomes hardest. But I just wanted to remind people maybe that, you know, we were heading into this crisis in a bad place. You know, Cian's already spoken about kind of the long-term living standards effect. Poverty rates in Wales hadn't really declined for a decade. You know, about 23% of people in Wales were said to be living in poverty before the crisis. Kind of the most recent rise in costs, that's over 700,000 people that were estimated to be living in poverty. And, you know, there's a real concern that a lot of these people are the people who are going to be hit hardest now by the rising costs. So there's concern that we're going to see a shift of people from poverty into destitution, you know, into being unable to afford those essentials. And that's kind of backed up with some of the data we have. So we've done 3 sets of polls over the course of the pandemic and the start of the cost of living crisis with YouGov. We did our last one in November, and we're hoping to run another one over the next couple of months. But what we found back in November was that at that point in time, 39% of Welsh households struggled to afford anything beyond the basics. So, you know, a very, very large proportion of Welsh households there didn't have any disposable income left beyond those basics. And of that 39%, about 165,000 people, households rather, I should say, either sometimes or always struggle to afford essentials. And to put that figure into context, that's about the same size as the number of households we have in Cardiff. So, you know, very, very large numbers, and that had deteriorated from when we ran the same poll in May as well. So, you know, we were heading into these most recent costs already in quite a difficult position. And what households been doing to manage? Well, cutting back is obviously one of the things open to households. And again, from the same survey we did in November, you can see here there's a clear difference in terms of income distribution here in terms of what people are doing. So households on the lowest incomes, you know, we've seen over half in November cutting back on their utilities. You know, very high numbers also on clothing and food for adults. You know, so cutting back, and we saw a difference as well with households with children really trying to cut back on what food for adults and adults' position to try to protect their children. And what does that look like? Well, I was visiting the community yesterday, and I heard from someone who was saying that she's told her children now they can only have a shower every other day rather than every day. You know, it's that sort of stuff that we're talking about that's affecting communities all over Wales. The other option if you can't cut back, you know, if you are at the limit, there is nothing more to cut back. It's to borrow money or to fall into arrears. And in November, we heard that about 12% of Welsh households had fallen behind on a bill in that period, and about a quarter had borrowed money to kind of cover the essentials. And again, this was weighted heavily towards the lowest income households, being the households most likely to have to do this. And that's going to have an effect as well on our public services. You know, if people are not paying their council tax, you know, council tax debt quadrupled over the course of the pandemic. You know, so what's going to happen there? How are we going to be funding our public services if people's budgets just don't stretch enough to cover a lot of these essentials? And then just to close before we kind of open out to broader discussions, another concern we picked up on is that this is having a real squeeze on a lot of the community responses. So as Cian highlighted, you know, that the support provided through the state is currently not enough for people. You know, traditionally we've seen, you know, kind of well, we've certainly seen the emergence of things like food banks over recent years. But a lot of those organisations try to provide support beyond just the emergency food, you know, because providing the emergency food doesn't change the fundamentals that of the crisis that family is facing. But a lot of those approaches are not particularly effective at the moment. You know, what a lot of organisations used to do was to give people advice on switching energy provider, for example, for a cheaper deal. Well, you can't. You know, they're all really expensive at the moment. So a lot of those long-term managing your budget sort of advice just isn't going to make any meaningful difference. You know, demand for emergency provision has surged as well. So you know, those services are becoming under huge pressure. And we heard real concerns about staff and volunteers being exhausted, you know, and the ability of local authorities as well to be able to get money out the door, and because the numbers of people, the number of different schemes that they're trying to operate has increased. So there's real pressure there, and that's one of the reasons why kind of the work we did back in February that Laura mentioned, we very much focused on trying to boost and grow schemes that already existed, rather than creating further pressure on local authority staff. Because that support was likely not going to get out the door because, you know, there is these limitations now on resources. There's also concerns as well, you know, about who's going to be making donations. Will we see a reduction in donations to a lot of this charitable support that people have been relying on? And some of these schemes that we're trying to operate on kind of on a more sustainable basis is also coming under pressure. So we did, there was a joint session on Tuesday between the cross-party groups of the Welsh and Scottish Parliament on poverty and the UK Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on poverty. And we heard there from Action and Care Nearly, so a charity in Cardiff, who were saying that they run a food pantry, so where people pay £5 to have heavily subsidised food. So, you know, gets around the stigma of food banks and also tries to have that long-term viability here, but it's not just charity, you know, people are buying into it. But they were finding more and more people were struggling to find the fiver to pay for that, you know, kind of that support. So are a lot of these schemes financially viable, especially if we're going to see less donations coming in on them as well? So there is kind of quite a challenging outlook, I think, on the front line from what the data Cian shared. And I think, you know, there's a real concern that, as Cian forecast, you know, things are likely to get worse before they get better. So I'll hand back to Laura. Yeah.
Diolch yn fawr, Steffan. There were some staggering figures and examples in that presentation, which I think have really brought the cost of living crisis into sharp focus for us all. At this point, I'm going to close the open part of this session and we will stop recording. So if you're watching this back at a later date, thank you for your attention.